Hi, community. It's Ellen Blustein again, Executive Director of the JCC. And for today's reading, I must be hungry and I'm trying not to go to the grocery store. I'm isolating. And, or what do they call it? Social isolation, whatever it is, social distancing. I thought of my cookbook called The Book of Jewish Food by Claudia Rodin. And Claudia, it was published in 1996, I believe, and she's a Sephardic woman from Egypt. I think the Egyptians are called Mizrahi. She wrote this book, which is largely an encyclopedia of Jewish food and culture, more than it's a book of recipes, although there are a lot of recipes in here. So I was just going to read a bit about two cultures, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, where she explains the differences. Organizing the book to combine history and recipes with stories and personal anecdotes was very difficult. It was clear that I should divide it into two parts, representing the two main groupings and cultural branches of the Jewish people, Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Mainly because Ashkenazi cooking is standard and the history which explains it needs to be told separately. The Sephardi grouping is arbitrary. In the strict sense, the term Sephardi designates only those Jews whose ancestors lived in the Iberian Peninsula, Sefarad, meaning Spain in Hebrew. Learn something new every day. But in the broad sense in which it is used today, it signifies those Jews whose roots are around the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and in Asia. These days, in Israel, all Jews who are not Ashkenazi are classed as Sephardi, although many of the communities share little of the heritage of Spain or the Mediterranean, and have never thought of themselves as Sephardi. The alternative to call the Sephardi recipe section as belonging to the other Jews would not do either. Although it represents the cooking of people from many different countries and cultures, there is a certain unity, which means that the great majority have enough in common to make their dishes go well together in a meal. For the sake of clarity and simplification, the Sephardi introduction allows the broad story that links the communities, makes sense of the recipes to be told, although it focuses on the Iberian story. It leaves out the stories of many unique and important communities, but these find a place throughout the recipe section. From the 10th century, when they emerged, until the 20th century, when they came together for the first time, each group, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, developed its own separate culture in separate geographic areas. Broadly, the dividing line was the mountains that divide the north and south of Europe all the way from Caucasus via the Alps to the Pyrenees. That the significant migration in Jewish history have been between east and west and not between north and south encouraged the division between Sephardi and Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazim are the Jews whose origin lies in Western and Eastern Europe and Russia. Their culture developed in a Christian world. It was born in the Middle Ages in Western Europe and most particularly in Germany. Ashkenaz is the Hebrew name for Germany, and Yiddish, the Ashkenazi language, which is written in Hebrew characters, I'm turning the page, is a 13th century South German vernacular. About 2 out of 3 Jews in the world are Ashkenazi. Although in Israel, the Sephardim are slightly more numerous. The Sephardi world stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. With the exception of Christian Italy and Spain and parts of India, almost all the lands where the Sephardim lived before the 17th century were under Islamic rule. Judeo-Spanish, Judesmo, or Ladino was the language of the Iberian Sephardism. There was a time when Sephardim and Ashkenazim did not marry each other's daughters. In my father's family, intermarriage was considered a mesalliance, a major catastrophe. In Egypt, Ashkenazim were thought of as lacking in refinement and their women as dangerously free and flighty. I'll take free and flighty. People were contemptuous and mocking about Ashkenazi cooking and would make guttural choking sounds when they pronounced words like krepchach and knedlech. The Ashkenazim no doubt felt the same about the Sephardim, and that was also the case centuries ago. There are dozens of written accounts of Ashkenazi travelers to the east who were so horrified to see their co-religionists sitting on the ground and eating with their hands that they could not bring themselves to eat their strange foods. One example is in the travel letters of Rabbi Obadiah of Bertinoro, written between 1488 and 1499 during a journey to the Holy Land, translated by Yaakov David Shulman in a book published in 1992. In a letter to his father, Rabbi Obadiah describes a Sabbath meal at a feasting house in Alexandria when he was a guest of Rabbi Moshe Grasso, who was also the ambassador of Venice. This is how the Jews in all the Muslim lands eat on Shabbos. They sit in circles on mats. There is no table. Instead, a small tablecloth is spread out on a mat on which are placed many varieties of local fruits. Wow. A certain Rabbi Menachem, who was granted lavish hospitality in a Jewish household in Jerusalem, recounts he could not eat and enjoy their dishes, for they are different to our people and strange to a healthy man. Until recently, each group knew little about the cuisine of the other. When my parents first came to London after Suez in 1956, how many of us remember that? Jewish neighbors knocked on the door to welcome us. My mother invited them to tea, and when they saw the sesame bracelets, little cheese pies, and nut-filled pastries, they asked, "Are you sure you are Jewish?" When I married an Ashkenazi of Russian origin, my then mother-in-law announced at once that she was sorry, but she would not eat my fancy food. The differences in the two styles of cooking have to do with climate, soil, local produce. The Ashkenazi world is a cold world. It is a world of chicken fat, onion, garlic, cabbage, carrots, potatoes, freshwater fish, especially carp, and salt herring. The Sephardi world is a warm one of peppers and eggplant, zucchini, tomatoes, rice, cracked wheat, saltwater fish, and olive oil. The Ashkenazi culture is Northern European and Slavic. The Sephardi predominantly Mediterranean, Middle Eastern. Whereas Jews in Christendom were mainly provincial, Jews in Islam were mostly urban, concentrated in ports and main cities. The Ashkenazim were more cut off than the Sephardim from the non-Jewish world, confined as they often were to ghettos and restricted areas. Their history since the late 12th century is full of persecutions and expulsions. Whereas they were more concerned with spiritual and intellectual values, the Sephardim were more preoccupied with secular pursuits and more interested in the senses. Ashkenazi women in Eastern Europe generally worked outside the home. Sephardi women stayed home and spent hours in the kitchen. There were few cases where the two worlds overlapped geographically, and when they did, it was a matter of one culinary culture's taking over the other. There was no fusion of styles, no Ashkenazi-Sephardi hybrids, and no unifying element. In Venice, cooking styles remained separate and distinct from the 16th until the 20th century. In the Balkans, the Ashkenazim were swamped in numbers by the Iberian Jews in the 16th century and adopted the Judeo-Spanish language as well as cooking styles. In Amsterdam, there is a little sign now in the kitchen of the enormous migration from Spain and Portugal in the late 16th century. Jewish cooking in Holland is Ashkenazi. In South America, no foods are associated with the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who came in the 16th century. The two styles that have predominated there since the 19th century are Syrian and Ashkenazi. The first Jewish cookbook published in English in 1846, the Jewish Manual, edited by a lady, an anonymous lady, contains a large number of Spanish and Portuguese recipes with the few German and Eastern European as well as familiar English and French ones, but Iberian dishes have disappeared entirely from Britain as Ashkenazi cooking became the sole Jewish style. A few dishes said to have been adopted by the Ashkenazim from the Sephardim are macaroons and almond cakes, sponge cake, which is like the Sephardi pan de España, and the English fried fish in batter, which is also a Portuguese import. The two worlds have now come together in the same countries through intermarriage. So that's a little reading for today about Jewish cooking and the difference between the Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And fortunately for us, these things have merged in our lifetime, so we have really a beautiful wealth of things to draw on and eat from our cultures. Take care.